And always happy to do Hack the Capital as I try to also figure out where my mouse is right now. Yeah, I think it's a one-of-a-kind event, and always happy to support it to be able to link up some of the conversations we're having with cybersecurity, but also obviously with what we're doing in the industrial control system space. So I've got about 20 minutes here because I do not want to run into the next panel. If you want to go into the other track, I think it's gonna be a really awesome panel. So I will define as quickly as possible, but also as thoroughly as possible, cyber risk. When we talk about it in the industrial space in particular, and also hopefully give some folks some context to some of the things that we've done in the policy space. There's actually been a lot of policy implications for cyber risk over the past decade plus now when dealing with critical infrastructure. So if we can, let's see, make sure I can change my slides. You can go, slides. I believe in you. There we go. I won't waste so much time on to my introduction of who it is that I am. Just know that I come from a background of also working as an asset owner and operator, sort of securing the systems that we're talking about today, as well as working in the federal government. So actually working on the regulations and some of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later today. And at Dragos, what I'm doing right now is actually linking a lot of those pieces together, making sure that the things that we're discussing in the executive management world is linked back to the reality of sort of the boots on the ground of what it is that we're experiencing, but also sort of forward leaning as to some of the implications it may have for controlling these things and securing them as best as possible. But first, what I want to be able to start off with is really a conversation around the tale of two executives, two different executives of the exact same industrial organization that are talking about risk. Because when we think about risk, it's a little bit different than sort of the day-to-day activity that we're typically managing. And so the very first thing that you'll sort of notice, if I were to go into the quarterly board reading, I'll have the chief financial officer go and present first. And the chief financial officer is going to present some really amazing graphs and charts to his boss and the board of directors, where they're talking through, well, here's what our risks are and the main countermeasures we use for financial risk. So where our pocketbook is really getting hit and what the impacts are associated with that risk. And then they may move on to be able to talk about sort of the adverseness or the appetite that they have for risk in different areas that could include sort of the generic strategic areas all the way down to what their legal department is looking at, where they may be a little bit more risk averse. And they'll also be able to give you margin sensitivity analysis as to the financial risk. So when they're building these things out, it's a really compelling discussion about what an organization should manage when it comes to financial risk. And then we have my dear friend, the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. I have an asterisk there because sometimes the CISO may not even be the same level as the CFO. They may be sort of buried somewhere else in the organization, often to a closet somewhere that they break out for these board meetings. And when the CISO is getting ready to present their metrics and show the board all the cool things that they've been doing, you immediately get slapped with something like this. And this is not for all of my CISO friends. I have a lot of CISOs out there that do a lot more than this, but this is the typical journey of maturity we see across CISOs, where they may start saying, well, there are 50,000 attacks on our firewall per day, which if they say that, the definition of attack may be a little bit different than what we really want it to be. They may say, well, just last year alone, we had almost 18,000 vulnerabilities just in 2020. And there was a 30% increase in the threat activity groups last year being tracked that target our organization. And it really becomes this overwhelming, wow, what is happening here? The conversation of risk from the CFO is very different than risk that we're seeing here from the CISO. And so undoubtedly chaos will ensue. We have to be able to get more additional reports. Maybe we're tracking all these vulnerabilities, and it's all information that frankly the board really isn't going to be concerned about. It's more granular than when you present to a board. And when executives see this, they start to think that, well, maybe risk does not equal risk. Maybe we're not treating this in the right way, or we're at least not measuring it in the same way that other organizations do. The concept of risk has been around for hundreds of years. The concept of cyber risk has been around for decades. And so when we try to manage that or try to at least be able to talk about it, we in the security industry may not be as mature as other areas. And it only gets worse when we think about this from a regulatory perspective. When regulators see that conversation, as a former regulator, I can tell you, it is actually a little bit more trying of a conversation to have from a policy-making perspective, because a lot of that compliance discussion gets tied to risk. And that's very different. Compliance does not equal risk, though compliance does have its own versions of risk. And what I want to be able to sort of provide folks some context to before I figure out how we can solve this problem together is one, some real world examples, what we've done in industry over the past 10, 20 years that really have highlighted our risk conversations and our risk discussions to date. And what we got right across all of those, as well as maybe some things that we have gotten wrong. And some things that maybe we're improving on. I should say that, maybe opportunities for success instead of what we got wrong. One of the first ones that you'll hear from a popularity perspective is what we've done in the nuclear sector. And from a real world example, some of the cool things that happened out of the NEI 0809 standards, these are the standards that are a part of the regulatory regime within the nuclear sector, is really built upon, well, what is the design basis threat, an engineering approach to understanding the impacts and then applying controls to minimize those impacts. That sounds exactly what the CFO was talking about with their version of risk, right? So that's a really positive thing that we saw was sort of this engineering approach to managing the threats, really basing it on reality, on scenarios that would be realistic for our facilities. Now, what we've sort of seen as a result for that, unfortunately, is really a stagnation in some of the technology approaches that we've been able to see in nuclear compared to other sectors. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's just something that is a little bit different. If you sort of see any videos or tapes from things that are happening in nuclear facilities from like the 1970s, it's going to look the exact same thing as today. And that has, in some cases, left these areas to be more secure because there aren't really sort of the ability for there to be manipulation on a computer side for those things. However, simultaneously, it's sort of limited what are the optimizations or other things that we can bring to bear in those nuclear environments. The other one that will be very popular and related to nuclear is on the electric side. So once I get past things that are happening in the nuclear plant and I go into a substation and I get from that substation to my outlet here in my home, well, not that much because NERC stops at another substation, but there's this sort of large area internally where we have additional regulations that are in place. And we actually tried Riskbased in NERC. For those of you who are new to NERC, you may not remember, but this is actually very top of mind for most people from the sort of early 2000 when we're doing urgent action to about the 2010 to 2014 timeframe. We actually allowed there to be a risk-based assessment methodology for identifying what assets should be regulated under NERC. Now, when you go to your utility and you say, if you select a risk-based approach for this, and anything that you select will now get regulated and have mandatory requirements that if you don't do well on can lead to penalties, what do you think the sort of natural outcome of that selection process will be? You would not be surprised to learn that a lot of discussions at utilities were how to not sort of get these assets to become critical, which would then get applied to the protections of regulation. So we did a actually really good thing where we sort of course corrected, and some utilities will talk about the pain points as part of that course correction though, because we went from one regime where we were able to apply risk based off of the impacts to our system to being told what that impact is going to be, defining a threshold, and therefore identifying what is going to be compliant as a result. Those lessons learned took a lot of time. And we now see one of the benefits out of NERC has actually been this sort of comprehensive approach to OST security. If you read the standards cover to cover, it's providing you with everything you'd want to see in any security program, just really sort of tailored toward what's in the electric sector. And it's written by asset owners, which is another key strength. It's not somebody else telling them how to secure their systems. It's actually other peer utilities who are helping in the creation of those standards, which is absolutely where you want to see an OT, because you don't want non-ideal controls from like the IT world put into these more delicate OT systems. That said, there have been a lot of changes, and those changes mean that you need to constantly adapt to what your compliance program looks like, because an auditor is going to come through, look at it and say, well, if I don't see evidence for that, you may be not compliant. And so as the sort of the mindset changes and the requirements change, everything that sort of supports that change from a compliance perspective becomes what I'd call here change-induced panic, where you don't know what it's going to look like when you get audited next time. And so you may be more averse to changing things from a compliance perspective, even though if it makes more sense from a security perspective. And then you'll also hear things about NIST. NIST is also sort of a great expansive library of requirements. It started off with more IT-centric things with what we call the 853 series. And as we moved into 882, we started getting more into the ICS space and then understanding that we could adapt that further, what was called the cybersecurity framework of the NIST CSF. The cool thing about it is that we got tailorable guidance out of it. So we're able to look at the controls that we absolutely want and sort of discard the ones that don't make sense for our systems based off of what they're doing in the control aspect. That said, even though this is totally open and anybody can go pick them up, the scalability for a NIST-based program is pretty difficult. You do need to have a lot of additional resources come to bear, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a challenge for some private sector organizations. So as we sort of think through this, we got to now this place where the cyber risk discussions became very standard based. And standards, again, come with their own sort of idea of what should be compliant, which leads to a different additional difficulty across the board. Because when I'm trying to then have this conversation with executives, the conversation really should be about, well, what's important? And why is that important? And can a standard tell me that? Can a compliance program tell me that? And who needs to know about the risk itself? What are we doing to prioritize those investments on our systems? And does risk ever change is another key thing. And how often does risk change? Does it change because there were 18,000 vulnerabilities in 2020 alone? Or does it change because the impacts associated with my system may be a little bit different as a result? So how do we fix this? Or at least how can we start tackling this problem so that our executives are speaking in a similar language so that the CISO or the Chief Information Security Officer is having a very similar conversation or at least at the same level of maturity as what we're seeing from the CFO? Well, one of the things that we just did recently, I actually had written a white paper with some awesome people here at Dragos about what to do for risk management and distilling it to make it simple because there are so many standards out there and there's these difficult policy making discussions that influence what's happening on the day-to-day for asset owners and operators. And one of the very first things we did is try to simplify everything to create sort of OT specific cyber risk guidance that could sort of cut to the concerns that we have in the industrial space. And if folks were new to risk, we wanted it to be inviting. We wanted folks who have been sort of trained in the operating space to understand that the risk discussion is more of a management discussion and bring them on board with that. And if they're risk veterans, how to make sure they can speak in the language of OT that made sense. And lastly, sort of create this idea of a maturity model that would also allow there to be a growth trajectory in this space. And one of the key things that we did is we actually started mapping the things we do in risk management to business continuity, to disaster recovery, which are things that we actually do really well in the OT space. If you go to any utility in the United States, we're really well at understanding what a hurricane prevention or sort of response looks like, what that natural disasters like earthquakes can mean for rolling out trucks and responding and recovering. So what if we took the idea of cyber risk and linked it to that? Because they have the same assets, they have the same sort of similar controls, it's just that the threats are a little bit different. And if we're really good at one, why reinvent the wheel when addressing the other? And the key way that we sort of discussed that was redefining the cyber risk equation, where you would typically look at this and say, yes, if I take my consequences and my threats and my vulnerabilities and I just mash them together, that is what my risk is going to be, because I need to have an impact from a threat adversary based off vulnerabilities in my system to understand what is risk. But in disaster recovery, we actually talk about things a little bit differently, where we have this idea of hazards and exposures, which map very clearly to consequence and threat, and what we do from a capacity to respond being the different thing. What do we do when there's actually a hurricane that has wiped out part of our network? We have a capacity to respond. It's just that that's not the new normal. We're building back to the old normal. That capacity to respond allows us to bounce back. And that's one of the things that we adapted to include into the cyber risk equation for industrial spaces. It's something unique for us that we can actually leverage our engineering expertise to respond to cyber risk. Where if you're new to the concepts here, the threats are things, for example, at Dragos that we manage by looking at activity groups that we look at just in the industrial control system space. Vulnerabilities is public information you can even get on DHS's website. Here's just pulling one out right here. And that resilience capacity to respond comes from how it is that we operate, which leads the big question to be, how is it that we can measure and understand the consequences? So we actually applied that to a normal method you'd use for typical risk management. The CFO actually uses a workflow just like this, just tailored towards finance. It's using a standard called ISO 31000, and we adapted that for industrial control system spaces, where we look at, for example, the risk characterization. What are our assets? What are our systems? How do we use our engineering expertise to understand what is important? Because then we can sort of figure out from a health perspective, what are the things that could go wrong? What could that impact look like? And then one thing that's really important, is relatively new for how we talk about things in ICS security, is understanding the threats. So you're refining what can go wrong by understanding what capabilities are out there. What can bad actors actually do? Use real world events that have happened in the past to understand what are the things you can improve in your systems. You sort of build out hypotheses for these and build out scenarios that make the most sense to you of what it could happen, what a sort of adversary can do to manipulate your system, to cause loss of view, manipulation of control, where you may respond to a bad day. And then build into that sort of this idea of, in this case here, an example with Xenotime, one of the activity groups we track at Dragos, to understand their capabilities, to map them to your systems, and therefore have a better way, a more informed way of talking about that cyber risk. You can then sort of take that context and build out sort of this idea of cyber-based impacts, where you want to sort of measuring things in terms of what makes sense to you from an impact perspective. And you can do that really simply. So this is actually an example here that is a little bit unique for what it is that we do in industrial control system space, where you can see I have all the way from what would be considered very low to very high, but I'm defining the values that make sense to me. And in industrial control systems, I'm looking at things like environmental impacts. That's not something you're going to see at a bank. It's something that's very unique for us in industrial control systems, where a sort of event on the cybersecurity side could lead towards actual physical impacts in the real world. Same thing with national level security impacts. If you're feeding power, for example, to a military installation, that could have national security impacts if you were to have a breach. And understanding that and ranking that will then help you understand how it is that you should evaluate your risk. And we sort of recommend doing this in 3 different tiers, where you could start off with sort of an architecture review and then build into a qualitative risk evaluation before what is way more nerdy on the quantitative risk side, actually having numerical values associated with risk, which is very CFO level. But building into that maturity helps out the CISO when they're getting ready for this discussion. And that sort of evaluation way would sort of look at a way to be able to map out things like, if I have sort of an increased threat actor here that is getting better motivation, better sort of skill sets, but my impacts are also increasing, well, then I may have risks that are at sort of the higher level of this heat map compared to things where I don't have a motivated actor, or there's a very low impact that would be measured towards it. And we also map that back to things that would be a relationship to our ability to respond or our resilience, where if I'm decreasing in resilience and I have higher impacts, again, I'm at this higher level of the heat map that allows me to then have a more uniform way of describing cyber risk. So not everything is code red. I'm actually able to talk about this based off of threats and what it is we can do to respond and recover. And then sort of lastly, understanding that risk treatment is going to be different. Most people in this space, we talk about things in priority levels where everything is a priority. And we also always talk about things as only mitigating. We don't really have a conversation around, well, what can we do to avoid the risk? Or maybe we can defer the risk until we have an ability to respond better, or even transfer. There are a lot of conversations now with cyber insurance where they're covering things that are happening in the industrial control system space that weren't happening 5 years ago even. And having a more mature conversation here is exactly what they do for safety risk, for financial risk, for other areas of the business that makes sense for us to be able to, at least on a maturity level, have the same dialogue. And lastly, sort of understanding that nothing will be zero. You can't drive risk down to zero, but you drive it to something that you can then manage at the end of the day. And what is also really important is, so you do all this cool work with risk, what are you doing to monitor it? How are you able to sort of track changes over time? This isn't sort of a destination point of view. This is something that we're building to improve and get better at. So one of the things that we recommend is capturing here a risk register, where you can sort of see in the middle here, I've got all these different types of impacts that we showed you earlier, and can very quickly see what is the risk, who owns the risk, what our response is, and also, cool, what is the cost benefit analysis? If something has got a $70.5 million impact and the actual way to prevent it is $350,000 in monitoring and training, that looks like a really good way to spend your bottom dollar. And understanding that and building that is one way that you can find improvement over time. Understanding that you want to be able to have a quick way to refer to this, and you also want to be able to make sure that you are constantly refining it. Again, just borrowing lessons learned from that CFO who just did an awesome job during their board presentation compared to what we just did. We want to be able to mature and improve with that. Which leads into this sort of last idea of what are we doing to communicate that risk? Are we able to have a common dialogue of terms and phrases that we're using across the organization? Do we have risk committees? Are we able to sort of figure out who our stakeholders are and involve them? And one way we can do that is actually by building an industrial cyber risk management committee internal to our organizations that involves the board of directors, involves executive leadership, but also you can see here, key, having both IT and OT security and bridging this across multiple stakeholders, including human resources, procurement for your sensitive systems, your financial, and of course, your operations, your engineers, who are at the end of the day, the ones who are taking care of the system that you're putting security around. And you can do this with using things like, for example, out of COBIT, where we're able to actually get involvement across our stakeholders to find out what the cyber risk committee is doing, to get to management and operations, and they're able to report and monitor all the way back up that same chain, which again, at the end of the day, provides more accountability and gets us to be able to solve this question very similar to how the CFO is doing it. So we're back in that boardroom. We've just enacted all these new cool things. And instead of saying doomsday, 50,000 attacks on our firewall, hey, we have 18,000 vulnerabilities in 2020, what if we were able to show the board sort of how we can manage with a risk register? How we're able to quantify our different risks that we're able to see, or at least qualify them in a way that we can measure them from threats and resilience perspectives, to including sort of a high level view of how those impacts can be felt across our organization. And if there are any questions about the threats, we have threat profiles now that outline what are the things that are identified in our environments based off our impacts, where a threat adversary is actively trying to, or potentially try to, cause a halt in operations. If they're able to do that, then we may find ourselves in an area where chaos does not ensue, because we're applying this more from a maturity-based discussion. Just like that CFO, we're talking about raising the dialogue then, not just across board of executives, but also then when we're talking about policy making, making sure these risk discussions are based in reality of what the organization's facing, not on an arbitrary standard somewhere else. It's something that's now internalized and is part of how it is that we do business, not just that cybersecurity is something odd over there on the side. All right, I know I did that quickly because I really want to make sure you can get to the next panel, which is really cool and awesome. So in this case here, if you've got more questions or would like to be able to see more information about what this risk discussion could look like if we were more mature with it, highly recommend going to dragos.com/OT cyber risk. That's where you find the white paper. And our year in review also has got a lot of cool information if you're really concerned about industrial control systems and want to know more about vulnerabilities, threats, and some of the topics that I gave you today. With that.
Hey, JD, thank you very much for the talk. Always a pleasure. We got one question.
All right.
Do you see an over-reliance with insurance?
Not yet, no. Instead, what I see is mismanaged insurance, where I see some folks buying an insurance product that they think will cover industrial cyber risk, but it doesn't. It'll cover basically IT risk, like the breach of employee data or the breach of billing data, and it won't cover things like property damage. And so some folks will just say, oh, that should be covered in our general liability policy, but it's not, because you need an actual tailored product based off of the impacts that I just sort of outlined that you could then get a insurance sort of quote around. So I don't see an over-reliance on. As a matter of fact, I see people not understanding what insurance does and does not cover and making bad decisions based off of that.